Alright everyone, it's time to talk about the origins of mankind because a new set of fossils has been found that supposedly points to the possibility that the out-of-Africa theory is wrong and that it's actually the out-of-Europe theory 200,000 years before there are any remains in Africa. First and foremost, this is not proven. This is conjecture. It could be a species of extinct ape that was literally nothing more than an ape. It could be that these are improperly dated, and on further review they find they're a million years newer. So we have to keep that in mind. That being said, though, we don't really know our true origins. The out-of-Africa theory, as an explanation for those who haven't studied anthropology, the out-of-Africa theory is only predominant because the oldest hominid fossils that we can positively identify as being hominids come from Africa. Prior to more recent finds, it was essentially the out-of-Asia theory. The oldest fossils had been found there. Prior to that, of course, you get sort of the biblical stuff about, no, these fossils are just apes, man 6,000 years old, or these were deposited during the Great Flood or something like that. You know, the world was created recently. Anything much prior to Babylon or Egypt is obviously a ploy of Satan to confuse us. These dinosaur things were just dragons. Humans obviously hunted them and rode them around and butchered them and ate their dino meat and stuff like that. And that's what you get. We don't even know exactly what climactic situation humans evolved under first. Now, there's the aquatic ape theory, which explains webbing on the fingers and toes, and says humans essentially co-evolved with the shoreline. They were eating primarily like crustaceans and little fish and stuff. It was perhaps safer there, you know, whether ocean shore or lake shore. They had access to water. They had access to a more steady, sedentary food supply, and some of these rocky little outcroppings. They're eating like mussels and clams and stuff. Then there's the patchy forest theory, which explains that the bipedalism that was formerly attributed to humans arising on the prairies, sort of on the savanna, which is wide open, couldn't actually evolve in a vacuum without access to food supplies that were coming from trees, essentially. You had patchy forest, little patches of trees surrounded by some plains. These were used for shelter, they were used for protection, they had some degree of a food supply, and it would have been better for humans to evolve in. It wouldn't have made sense. People proponents of this theory, they say it doesn't make sense that humans would evolve in open fields. There wasn't as much food. What were they doing? Sitting there grazing like cattle on these grains, or what were they doing? It only explains bipedalism, really, or maybe the hand structure. And essentially, as humans leave the trees behind and start walking upright, there was no longer a need to have the sort of hand structure found more in an ape. You know, sort of the non-opposable thumbs and a big prehensile tail and stuff like that you'd find in a monkey species or something along those lines. But we don't know where man arose. But here's the secret. For the many people talking about this new find of Greco-Pithecus are misunderstanding one genetic truth. And that's that the primordial ancestor of man was almost certainly singular. The idea of multiple arisings of the human lineage in different continents doesn't really make a lot of biological sense. There was probably one origin. It doesn't particularly matter where that origin was, because the divergence that you see that explains race in the modern sense, that explains genetic differences between a European population and an African population, or an East Asian population and an Aboriginal population, those happen later. They happen long after these hominids that we're discussing. It doesn't matter what continent the original lineage arises in, because taking off from that original group prospers for a time, grows larger. Some groups move around over time as they find themselves encroaching into new climates with different light levels, different food sources, different everything, different temperatures certainly, different beasts that they have to be worried about, different beasts that they can potentially hunt and eat, different food species. Now, that's when they diverge. They diverge because their surroundings are different, and what is selected for is therefore different. They weren't diverging as long as they were in one primordial area because they were experiencing much the same thing. They were all co-evolving together. The group was evolving, it hadn't diverged. This is a basic principle within natural selection. Selective forces, when they were the same on this group, drove them in roughly the same general direction, selected for the same things. Only when they geographically diverged and then were largely not mixing with one another did they turn into modern races. And of course, there are probably racial groups that are extinct, like those hobbit people in, I think it's Indonesia, the 3-foot-tall hominids. Yes, this was a humanoid species, roughly proto-human in nature. Had basic technology. Homo floresiensis, I believe the name is. That we also have to answer the Neanderthal question. If we're talking about race, which seems to be the thing that importance is given to within the context of where humans arose, we're talking about Neanderthal inclusions and divergent cultures over the last 500,000 years. We're not talking about things that happened 7 million years ago. They hadn't diverged at all. It was one group of hominids, one single origin. Because they hadn't diverged, it doesn't matter where they're from. From this group, for instance, let's say out of Africa is true, and it has kind of been denigrated over time. And for those that didn't study anthropology, it's openly questioned within scientific circles. There's no conspiracy of scientists to say it's out of Africa, absolutely. It just happens to reflect the fossil reality that was generally noted, with the full admission that, yeah, if an older fossil were found in Alaska, I guess it would be the out of Alaska theory. I've studied these things. I'm not a big proponent of any of these origin theories because I don't think any of them can be appropriately proved. There's always potentially an older fossil that you simply haven't found. It doesn't matter, to tell the truth. When we're talking about these very primitive hominid lineages, we're not talking about modern race. One group, whether it arose in Africa, Asia, Europe, wherever, then diverged over time. Migratory movements split tribes apart. They can only grow so large. And we're talking about pre-hominid groups that have very, very little in the way of technology, that are not fully sedentary and tend to move around anyway. Only a certain number of individuals can inhabit a certain stretch of land and actually have enough food resources. Therefore, these wondrous ape-like creatures tended to wander around, and tribes tended to split up into groups when they found that there were no longer enough resources. The dominant members remained, the subjugated members perhaps schismed off or were forced out in a behavioral sense, and then went off to colonize some new region. As they slowly did this over time, these groups diverged into race. So it doesn't matter where they were from, because they weren't technically, in a genetic sense, they weren't European or African or Asian or anything else. It was just the hominid lineage. There was no divergence. You have to wait until later, millions of years later, to find that. All of these other hominid lineages, even millions of years ago, they do show divergence. The divergence in modern man is perhaps larger, I would say, in some ways, in a behavioral and cultural sense, because we now evolve in culture and language, not just in biology. The differentiation is more vast. It's also more behavioral. Any two human beings in the world today can mate, but can they culturally come together and actually sort of hit things off? That's more in question. That's what maintains divergence today and prevents the world from homogenizing in the age of world travel. And it won't homogenize. People who are worried that we're all going to become like one sort of homogenized group of people without any real culture are fooling themselves. It's not going to happen. You could even try to enforce such a thing. It wouldn't happen. For behavioral purposes only. Genetically, yeah, it's totally, in theory, it's totally possible. Behaviorally and culturally, nope, not possible. It'd start a worldwide civil war if you tried, so it's never going to happen. And that's that's generally a good thing. Maintains sovereignty, maintains culture, helps bind people together. At the same time, I suppose, yeah, if everyone were homogenized, maybe there'd be more peace, because you take the race question off the table, maybe. I don't think so. I think people would find other things to fight over. They'd be fighting over the nearest watering hole or a blade of grass, so that's fucking pointless. So when we talk about out of Africa, What they're saying is not, oh, Africans are less evolved, or yeah, hey, white man, you're just an African who turned white or something. That's not really what it means. We're talking about one primordial original ancestor. We don't even know what its racial characteristics necessarily would have been like. We can look at its bone structure. Do we know what skin color it had? No, we have no idea. Could have been an albino. Could have been, blacker than coal. We have no way of knowing. It doesn't matter either. It doesn't matter where it was from. I'm also of the belief, as far as more modern lineage goes, I'm not talking about the hominid question here, I'm talking more about the Neanderthal question. I'm of the belief that the Neanderthals, which we now know ate a lot of bark and moss without apparently having the means to process it, were in the process of a mass forced migration and were thus eating these things because they were starving. And the evidence actually fits what I've thought for some time, which is that these groups were not originally from the areas that we're finding their fossils in. They were hunkering down in caves because they had been forced into a nomadic activity. The mere fact that they were taking shelter and not living like animals and simply sort of squatting there when it rained under a tree indicates to me, as well as their sort of paintings and so forth, that they come from a higher culture that came before that collapsed, probably due to the last ice age. I believe that some group had hit the Copper or maybe Bronze Age at that time. I'm not talking about futurism or Atlantis crap here. I'm talking about a more legit reading of humanity. Had hit a level of sophistication, that these are the people spoken of as being gods or whatever, UFO travelers by various civilizations in their mythologies. They were scattered to the winds. They were absorbed into various civilizations, the Fertile Crescent, southern European cultures, especially within the Aegean region, back down into Africa within the Nile region, certainly into the Indus Valley. And that what little was left of their technology and their oral history was then adapted by their offspring, who added their genetic lineage to the local population of Homo sapiens, or whatever it would have been at the time. I'm not sure you can actually call it a fully modern man. No, it was more archaic than that. But they certainly did have technology. We do know that. They had a primitive culture of sorts, and yet they were more advanced than any other group, and yet they're scattering around and dying off. It doesn't make sense. If they had more technology, they should have been, despite slower breeding rates, quite well off. They could have easily figured out their way of perpetuating. Instead, they chose not to do so and were eating moss, bark, and mushrooms. To me, this points to them starving, not being used to where they were, because, how were they exactly processing tree bark? It's not exactly clear that, biologically speaking, man that recently the Neanderthal lineage would have been able to do so. Rather, it's a bit like the Donner Party or something like that. They were eating whatever they could get their hands on because they were starving. They encountered Homo sapiens. The Homo sapiens knew how to acquire food that was actually edible. They lived with them. They inevitably interbred into these groups, causing modern man. So, I think they had already achieved the Copper, maybe even the Bronze Age by that point. Essentially, maybe minus the bronze metallurgy, but the other trappings of that kind of culture. That the approaching glaciers forced them out of their northern European or northern Asian homes, or perhaps both, and that they interbred with these other individuals, thus adding their genetics. That's what I think happened. Totally theoretical. It just happens to fit some of the evidence that we see now, I suppose. It's just a theory that I happen to agree with. The out of Tula theory, you could call it, or something. Again, though, not necessarily a European lineage after the modern racial sense. You get several 100,000 years of further divergence. A lot of that genetics system is lost over that period of time. Human beings, of course, moving around and, again, continuing to diverge and mutate and so forth. Can you imagine some caveman that crawls into a cave, finds it's a highly radioactive cave, ends up with all sorts of weird genetic mutations, and then imparts them to a future series of children or something. Stranger things, I suppose, can happen. But the Greco-Pithecus fossils that have been found in southeastern Europe, they point to the possibility, not the certainty, that the out-of-Europe theory is actually true. That being said, 50 years from now, somebody could find an even older fossil in Australia. They could find it in Japan. They could find it in the Americas. There's no way really to tell. There could be an extinct lineage. Maybe millions of years before that, there was a hominid lineage that arose somewhere, persisted for a few tens of thousands of years, deposited a few fossils, and went extinct. This could also be what we're seeing here in the European sense. It could be that a few, slightly divergent ape-like ancestors had very, very primitive hominid features, but then died out and isn't even part of the modern genetic lineage. The same could be true for any randomly chosen number of hominids found in Africa. It could be they didn't persist. They arose, they persisted for a short time. The wider genetic world was isolated from them. They simply existed in a geographic vacuum, cut off by the Sahara or something, and then their genetics died out. The possibility remains. We've seen this in creatures before. That's about all. Peace out.